The first lesson is from Ruth, chapter 1, verses 8 through 19. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud, and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," Naomi said, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?"
Today's New Testament lesson is from Mark chapter 12, verses 38 to 44. As he taught, Jesus said, "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely." Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." Thanks be to God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit for the hearing.
Well, we've just heard 2 passages read for us this morning. One from the book of Ruth that Sheree read, and then also this little vignette from Mark's Gospel that Bruce read for us. Today's title of the sermon today is Shelter from the Storm, and we're going to be looking at another view of this question of how do God's people respond during times of crisis. And we're going to see again these 2 things that keep coming up over and over again. One is that in the midst of crisis, God proves himself to be faithful. And secondly, that God uses crises to shape and to grow his people. You know, life doesn't always go like we want it to. I was remembering this week about a time, it happened, quite a few years ago. My oldest son, Nick, was just 13 at the time, and he and I went backpacking in the Adirondacks. Our plan was to be out for about 8 days. We were going to be together 5 of those days out in the back country of the Adirondack Mountains, and we headed out. It was quite a great adventure. And the first day, we went in late in the evening, at just about dusk, so we only hiked in several miles to a place called Marcy Dam. Beautiful, serene place you can see here. That night, we stayed in a lean-to that was there. There were quite a few other campers. Also, there were quite a few bears in the camp that night. In fact, just about 20 yards from where we were camping for that night. A kid had his backpack torn apart as a black bear was looking for a granola bar or something like that. The next day we got up and we hiked a beautiful trail, this place called Avalanche Lake. Again, beautifully serene. You can see here there's some wooden walkways that are hung off the rock face right along the surface of the water. Really beautiful. We got there in time to make our dinner. Again, that night we had to scare black bears away from sharing our dinner with us. Later that night, 3 drunk French-speaking Canadians came and squeezed into the lean-to with us. They were not very pleasant companions that evening, but we got up early the next morning before sunrise, and we set off. We were going to do the summit of Mount Marcy, which is the highest peak in the Adirondacks. It was rainy that morning, drizzly and wet. We got into our rain gear and put ponchos over our backpacks, and we headed out. And the train was kind of rough going. It was a little bit slick because of the rain, but some interesting woods nonetheless. After several hours of hiking, we stopped to eat a lunch of some crackers and cheese along the trail. It was so foul weather that as we stood there eating, a fisher cat bolted through the woods and came just within feet of us. Couldn't even notice it through the rain. That was pretty miserable. We made it to the top of the mountain that night, that afternoon. And because of cairns, these piles of stones that others hikers have left behind on the bald rock face, we could find our way. And it was fortunate, actually, that those cairns were there. Without them, we would have made several disastrous wrong turns. Our plan was to spend the night in the woods that evening and camp out, but because the weather was so foul, I saw on the map that there was another rough lean-to. We would just have to hike several miles further, but we thought, let's just keep going and spend a night out of the rain. So we did. And it was a tough decline. The rocks were slippery. The trail was slippery. At one point, Nick slipped and his backpack and sleeping bag fell into a stream with him attached to them. And he was just drenched. Well, the rain had drenched all of us, but the backpack now and sleeping bag were soaking wet. And we got to the place where the lean-to was supposed to be, but it wasn't there. It had been decommissioned and deassembled some years before. This map didn't show that. Well, if we hiked another 3 or 4 miles, we could get to another place with a little bit of shelter for the night. And so we made our way there, rather. We showed up. It was well after dark. We found something to eat. We unrolled our backpacks and sleeping bags. I took Nick's bag because it was soaking wet, and we tried to make the most of that night. We threw our food bag up over the limb of a tree to keep it away from the bears, and it was a miserable, cold night. To make it worse, that evening, the bears again visited, and one had figured out how to trace the rope that hung a bag down to the trunk of a tree where it's tied off, climb up and cut the rope and drop the bag and find the goodies inside. And so when we woke up that morning, all that was left was a bit of a rag that used to be our bear bag, food bag, and 1 can of tuna that had its wrapper torn off and had been kicked around and pushed down by the stream. We were cold and miserable and hungry. We had planned on spending another 3 nights in the woods out there in the Adirondacks, but now we had no food, no dry clothes. So we had to change our plans, and we started heading out. Fortunately, our path lay along the line of the John Brooks Lodge, which is kind of like an AMC mountain hut. And after several hours of hiking mid-morning, we made our way there, and we entered in and asked if we could perhaps do some chores or wash some dishes in exchange for some breakfast. And the staff set us up with a really wonderful, warm breakfast. In fact, Nick was recalling this story a couple weeks ago, and he said he thinks that's the best tasting breakfast of his life. Well, that camping trip did not go as we expected. You know, life often doesn't go as we want it to. You know, there's a story that goes this way, that we all come into the world with everything we need for a life of love and belonging, with the ability to contribute meaningfully, and with all the provision to meet all the needs that we have so that we can just thrive in this life, or so the story goes. And it's true for some of us. Some of us are born with everything we need: a safe home, good nutrition, plenty of loving attention and care, appropriate levels of stimulation and challenge that foster learning and growth. Everything we need to be happy, healthy, contributing members of society, to take our place and to thrive in this interdependent human community. You know, but the story doesn't always play out that way, does it? There are some among us who, even before we're born, are subject to harmful elements that delay growth and hamper development and distort how folks grow physically. Others come into the world physically fine, but they lack the emotional care that they need to thrive. Negative social interactions implant distorted pictures of the world or of ourselves, of what we're capable of and what we can expect in this life. And then there are others of us who are blessed with good health and robust emotional lives, and we find, however, that something along the line goes wrong. An accident that leaves us crippled or frightened, an abusive relationship that saps away our sense of ourselves and our emotional well-being and confidence. We can find ourselves being the victim of other people's selfish actions that take from us what is rightfully ours, or leaves in ruins projects that we've given ourselves to. Sometimes we're the victims of our own poor choices. Habits that grow quietly and seem to be of little importance, but then suddenly bear fruit that is both bitter to eat and difficult to weed out. And of course, there are always things like war and famine, pestilence or plague, or as we all are so aware today, pandemics that disrupt our lives, leave us feeling vulnerable to forces beyond our control. And we can all find ourselves, from time to time, exposed to the storms of life, seeking a little shelter. Well, in today's passages, we've read about some widows. Widows are in a special category in Scripture, special for a couple reasons. One is that they are so remarkably vulnerable. Vulnerable because ownership of land and inheritance passes from male to male. So if a family has no male sons, no ones to inherit the land, then the land can be lost from that family forever. The family line can end. And those who are left as widows or orphans can find themselves deprived of the means to live and survive in this world. Well, the widows that we see today in this passage, a couple of them are remarkable examples for us of how to respond in times of crisis. In the passage that Bruce read for us from Mark 11, it says this, that poor widow gave all that she had to live on. She committed it to the temple treasury. She threw herself upon God and the provision of God's people when she was at the very end. Now, she stands in remarkable contrast to those teachers of the law that Jesus spoke about. He denounced them as being ones who like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplace. They like to have the most important seats in synagogues and places of honor at banquets. And it says this, that they devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers and these men will be punished most severely. It says they devour widows' houses. It means they take advantage of those ones who are most vulnerable right at their time of need. One way that we can respond to the storms of life is by seeking to build for ourselves a place of safety. And in this case, we see the teachers of the law did it at the expense of others. They were taking advantage of her vulnerability. Now, there's a lot that could be said today, right here, about the rich benefiting from the world's goods at a cost that is borne disproportionately by the poor. For it's no secret that the nations on this globe that have benefited the most from the energies of production and consumption that's powered by fossil fuels do not and will not pay as heavy an environmental price as do poorer countries. The trouble with the teachers of the law here is not that they had an eye for a good bargain or that they had a good business sense, but it's that they grew their wealth at the expense of others, securing personal wealth and protection that it brings by taking advantage of the vulnerable. For this, Jesus says they will be punished severely. And that's such a contrast to this poor woman who threw herself into God's care and to the care of God's people. Her impulse, when the challenges of life came, was to venture more fully upon God the provider. That's a beautiful picture for us. In the second passage, the one that Sheree read, it's just a little episode in the story of Ruth's life. Let me remind you briefly about what Ruth's story is and why it makes it into the Bible. Then I'll make a couple observations. The story starts with Ruth's father-in-law, although he wasn't even her father-in-law at this point. His name was Elimelech, and he lived in Bethlehem and Judea. And during his lifetime, Judea suffered a famine. There was no food to eat. So he gathered up his wife Naomi and his two sons, Malahan and Kilion, and they moved to the foreign country of Moab, where they could make a living. Now, leaving their home, I'm sure they sold what they had, left behind fields and houses to go make their way. Now, while they're there, their sons grow up and they both take wives, Orpah and Ruth. But it also happens that during their sojourn in Moab, that Elimelech dies. And shortly after, both of his sons die. That leaves Naomi now a widow, left without her husband and without her sons, without any male heirs. And she has these two beautiful daughters-in-law. Well, she has heard that the famine has passed in Judea, and she decides there's nothing left for me here in Moab. I'm going to go back to the house of my fathers. Perhaps I can find a way to survive there. And she tells her daughters-in-law, you stay here with your families. You stay here with the land that you know. I'm going back to Judah. Well, the first one, Orpah, who's ironically or incidentally her name means to turn one's back, she chooses to stay in Moab, and she says, God bless you, Naomi. Thanks for everything. I'm staying here. But the second daughter-in-law, Ruth, she says, no, I won't turn back. And let me read to you what she says. Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates me from you. What a beautiful commitment. Ruth, this second widow for us to consider today, chooses out of love to leave her own family, her homeland, that which is familiar to her, and cleave to her mother-in-law, Naomi, and go back to Judah. This passage expresses love and commitment and the binding together of two people's lives so beautifully. It's often read at wedding ceremonies. And this deed was noticed, not just by Naomi, but others as well. I'll tell you more about that. But first, let me just say a word about Naomi. She and Ruth make their way back to Judah, and when they get to Bethlehem, it says this: the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" They wonder, is this Naomi come back to us? No doubt they've heard news that her husband died in a foreign land. Not only that, but twice over her sons died. And here she comes back, and they wonder, oh, our dear sister has suffered such grief. Could this be Naomi, the one? And Naomi responds this way. You can read about it in verse 20, chapter 1. Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Here's what's interesting. You wouldn't know this just from reading the text, but Naomi, that name, means this: agreeable, pleasant, beautiful, lovable, my delight. What a lovely name, my delight, lovable, beautiful, agreeable, pleasant. Naomi says, don't call me Naomi. Rather call me Mara. Mara means bitter. She says, call me bitter because the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. He's brought me back empty when before I used to be full. Naomi, in this moment, gives herself a new name. It's a name that grows out of her hurt and grief and her disappointment and her fear, perhaps even out of a little bit of anger towards God that things have turned out so sorrowful for her. But it's interesting to note, Naomi chooses a new name for herself, but the narrator of the story does not follow the request. She continues to be referred to as Naomi throughout the rest of the story. It makes me wonder how many times I, or you, out of fear and anger or hurt, give ourselves new name. Rather than beloved, we adopt the name forsaken. Or perhaps instead of blessed, we adopt the name cursed. Instead of being aware of the one who is provided for, we only see ourselves as those who are empty and in a place of want. Now, Naomi has reason for disappointment, and she has reason for concern. She has little, and there's little that's within her power to do. Her husband's dead, her sons are dead, her family line is off the tracks, coming to a sad and tragic end. She is fully exposed to the ravages of grief, exposed to destitution. She's without shelter, and from where she stands, she's without hope. So she claims for herself the name bitter. Have you ever been there? I know I have, and for much less cause than Naomi had. But I believe that in the story of our lives, even when we adopt a name of bitter or empty or the cursed one, the author of our story continues to call us by our true names, whether we can see it or feel it or not. The beloved one, the one who belongs, the one who is provided for. That's something to think about. What names do you call yourself? And what name is the great narrator of your life story calling you by? Well, let's come back to Ruth here. Now, it's true that Naomi and Ruth show up to Bethlehem and they have nothing. So they avail themselves of a practice, a provision in the law that was made for widows and the poor. And it was a practice of gleaning, following along after the harvesters to collect bits of grain that was left behind. Here is an illustration from a Bible from the 13th century by William de Braos. And you can see the women gleaning here, and Ruth over to the one side. So Ruth goes out to glean, to pick up leftover grain that's fallen behind, and she finds herself in the field of Boaz. Now, that's where things get really interesting, because Boaz was a cousin of Elimelech. And that's good news, because it means that Naomi has a shot at redemption. Because a relative like Boaz, he's in a position to buy back the land that had previously belonged to Elimelech. And if he's willing to take Ruth as his wife, then the family line of Elimelech can continue in his own name. And any children that Ruth bears, they will be treated as Elimelech's grandchildren. They will inherit the land. It thus provides for the continuance of his family line, keeping the land and their inheritance, and providing for the family, for Ruth, the widow. This role, there's a special name for it in Scripture. It's called the kinsman redeemer. And it's because they're able to redeem a kinsman from utter ruin by keeping the family name and keeping the family land and wealth intact. It's a pretty cool way for keeping families going in Scripture. Now, the story tells us that when Ruth was gleaning, Boaz shows up in the field and he calls out to his workmen. He says, "Who's that over there?" She catches his eye. She must have been quite a looker, this young Moabite woman. So Boaz introduces himself to her and he says, "Listen, I want you to continue to glean only on my land. Don't go anywhere else. It might not be safe for you, but you'll be safe here. I've given my men instruction to keep an eye out, make sure that you're well." Not only that, without telling her so, he instructs his men to deliberately leave behind handfuls of grain so that she can come along behind and pick it up. In fact, her first day gleaning, picking up the leftovers, she collects nearly 30 pounds of grain to carry back home to Naomi. Well, when Ruth returns with this huge bag of grain, heavy, 30 pounds would probably be a bit for her to carry, she comes back and she tells her mother-in-law, Naomi, all about what her day was like and that she met this really nice guy, Boaz. Well, Ruth recognizes Boaz as one of her dead husband's cousins. And she hatches a plan that involves sending Ruth back to Boaz's sleeping spot that night. She tells her to freshen up, take a shower, put on a little perfume, and then at night, after everyone's asleep, to sneak back to the thrashing floor where all the workers live during the time of the harvest, and to find Boaz and to curl up next to him in his sleep. Now, here's a picture. You can see Ruth at Boaz's feet there. This is conceived, of course, in the Middle Ages, not quite what it would have been like in ancient Israel. But this is not just a scheme to entrap Boaz. Rather, Ruth is sending an intentional message. They say, "Boaz, we want you to play this role of kinsman redeemer for us, if you're willing." Well, and Boaz, we know, is predisposed to fulfill that role because Ruth has not only caught his eye, not only is she attractive in appearance, but she's also a woman of honor. He thinks highly of her. For the day that he met her, the day before, she gives her name, and he says, "Oh, yes." You can read about this, chapter 2, verse 11. "I've been told all about you, and I've heard what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you left your father and your mother and your homeland, and you came to live with a people that you didn't know before. Oh, may the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Isn't that something? I love that line. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Boaz recognizes that Ruth has taken shelter from the storms of life under the wings of the Most High. the God of Israel. And she did this when she pledged herself to Naomi, not knowing what lay ahead. So unlike those teachers of the law who were motivated by seeking only their self-interest by taking advantage of others, Ruth exposed herself to further unknowns by committing herself to Naomi's fate and taking shelter under the wings of the Most High. Well, and she finds it. God consistently chooses always to accomplish his work through his people, and in this case, Boaz. He steps forward, becomes the kinsman redeemer. When he awoke in the middle of the night to find this young woman at his feet, it's dark, he doesn't know who it is. He says, "Who is this? Who are you?" And she replies, "I am your servant, Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are our kinsman redeemer, guardian of our family." That phrase, "spread your garment over me," that's not just saying, "Hey, it's chilly, share some of that blanket." She's saying, "Take me as your wife. Be for us the kinsman redeemer. Bring me under your protection. Rescue our family line. Be for Naomi and me a shelter." Well, it was just a few more details they had to work out along the way, but Boaz does take Ruth as his wife, and he keeps the name of Elimelech alive, keeps the inheritance for Elimelech's offspring rather than his own, and Ruth bears him a son. Here's what's really interesting about this story. The son that Boaz and Ruth have together, his name is Obed. Obed becomes the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. Now, we know that Christ comes from David's line, so it's not only Elimelech's line that is saved. It's through Ruth and Boaz and this role of kinsman redeemer that Christ the Savior, a descendant of David, becomes the shelter for all of us. In fact, God chooses to call himself by this name, the Redeemer, the Guardian, the Protector. We see it in places like Isaiah 43. Well, how do we respond when the challenges of life comes, when the wind and rain pelt down, when we lose the resources that we thought we had, when the pathway before us only seems bleak and uncertain? Well, we can respond in one way by trying to build a shelter by disadvantaging others, taking advantage of the vulnerable. Not such an honorable thing to do. Or we can, like Naomi was tempted to do, we can turn within ourselves, turn towards bitterness, focus on our sorrow, be mindful only of what we have lost, rather than being mindful of hope. Or, like the widow in the Gospel of Mark, or like Ruth and Naomi here, to venture more fully upon the God who provides, under whose wings there is shelter. You know, God does use his people to accomplish that, and even in this day, there are ways for us both to find that provision of God and to provide that provision from God by caring well for others. Remember that. Remember the one who calls you is faithful. The one who calls you blessed is also a provider. Though you may not know how or where or when it will come. When the winds blow, venture more fully, press more fully into God with trust and action and hope, and see how he provides a Redeemer. God is faithful in times of crisis, and he will use every crisis to help his people grow. Amen.